as we continue in this chapter 6, the chapter discusses some researchers that use differential association or social learning theories as a way to let the reader know that this is a very relevant, very salient set of sociological theories that are useful in describing and predicting deviant behavior. First off, they're talking about Akers doing a Midwest self-report study of drug abuse and drug use. 3,000 students, grades 7 through 12, and found that social learning variables were predictive of alcohol and marijuana use and problems associated with drug and alcohol abuse. Neff and Waite look at differential association and social learning theories on or in reference to pure substance use. They have access to 4,846 males and 576 females that were at that time involved in juvenile detention centers in Virginia, and they found that pure substance use is the strongest factor to affect an individual's use as well. Hostetler, Copes, and DeLisi, they use data from the National Youth Survey, conducted a longitudinal study, and as you might expect, if you're doing a longitudinal study, it'll give you a little bit of a better indication of whether differential association is important over the long haul versus a cross-sectional study that takes a snapshot look at things. In this particular study, the results show that variables derived from differential association theory were moderately to strongly related to delinquent behavior, and that the effects were not contingent on the presence of co-offenders, which is something a little bit different than what we've been seeing up to this point. Higgins and Tewksbury and Mustaine found that peers associations were among the strongest factors affecting binge drinking at college sporting events. And Reed and Roundtree found that peer pressure had little influence, and definitions favorable to substance abuse was more influential. To argue that your peer group doesn't influence whether you engage in deviant behavior or not is missing the point, at least in my humble opinion. There might be other variables that are more influential, but your peer group is certainly an important one. Boehringer studied male undergraduates in reference to rape and sexual aggression. Found that if you could be assured that you could in no way be punished for engaging in the following acts, how likely, if at all, would you be to force a female to do something sexual that she didn't want to do? Once again, social learning variables were important predictors of these forms of deviance as well. If others in your peer groups were doing those types of things, you would be more likely to either engage in them or condone them. Another study by Akers of male undergraduate students was conducted with the same dependent variables as Boehringer, and they added another form of non-physical technique of sexual aggression, or plying a woman with alcohol or drugs with the intent of making her so intoxicated that she will be physically or mentally unable to refuse sexual intercourse. Once again, if your peer group is engaging in this type of behavior, you're more likely to follow along or at least condone it. Good also used differential association and social learning theories, and they came up to refer to differential association and social learning theories as cognitive or intellectual deviance. So in the U.S., at least according to these folks, being an atheist is a cognitive deviance. And following along this line of thought, a large number of political, religious, and social beliefs are ultimately considered deviant by mainstream society. Some criticisms of differential association and social learning theories. Too much focus has been put on juvenile delinquency and other relatively minor forms of deviance. But we know that differential association can explain many behaviors, but some cannot be explained. The book uses an example of a serial killer or the mentally ill. Generally speaking, they don't have people that they're interacting with that are giving them positive or negative cues on whether they want to be a serial killer. They usually don't have someone in the family that they're looking up to that they know is a serial killer, but they still engage in those types of behaviors. So that is a pushback on differential association theories. And then theoretical and empirical rules of differential association are often measured as deviant. We see this as often measured as deviant behavior of one's peers, but it could be deviant behavior of the individual as well. The effects not only are focused on group behavior, but on the individual doing the offending as well. And we see it that they can be misguided by the black-white or dichotomous conception of the role of peer influences versus selection in and of itself. But as the authors state, there's no reason to believe that both can't be true. And sometimes in our pursuit of a dichotomous relationship with dichotomous solutions, we lose sight of the idea that both can actually be true. This leads us into cultural deviance theory. This theory is essentially stating that subcultural explanations emphasize the values, beliefs, rituals, and practice of subgroups in society that distinguish them from larger societies. So now we're looking at groups and not necessarily individuals. And there is an examination of unique aspects of the culture or subculture to assess how people learn to tolerate, justify, and approve of deviant activities. So let's look at the unique aspects of the culture or the subculture to then in turn try and understand why they do or do not engage in deviant activities. It's always the question of whether cultural deviance theory is the same as differential association and social learning theories. When you're thinking like this, you need to consider socialization in the process and how it exposes to and is reinforced by a given culture or subculture. For control theorists, they're linking differential association and social learning theories under a cultural deviance label. We see this in the work of Kornhauser and Hershey. And alternatively, Akers rejects the subcultural label for both Sutherland's differential associations and his own social learning theory. So even though these theories sound similar, the social theorists using them find them different. Wolfgang and Ferracuddy are also looking at subcultures of violence. They find a high rate of homicide among young minority males in inner cities. And they're using the subcultural theory and linking it to differential association and social learning theory. This is where we see social theorists trying to bring everything together to understand and predict violence within certain communities. The development of favorable attitudes toward and the use of violence in a subculture usually involves learned behavior and the process of differential learning, association, or identification. Anderson, by contrast, sees a decent and street families. So when they're parceling out the differences in cultural deviance theory, what they see is, in any given setting, you can have, or any given neighborhood, you can have decent people, decent families that are emphasizing decent norms and values, and then you have street families which are not emphasizing what decent and normal values should be. In reference to Anderson, terms recognized and used by the residents he studied in poor inner city, largely African American communities, can be broken down into these two categories. He argues that child rearing practices vary tremendously between these two groups. Decent families usually are strict and focused on the values of mainstream society, whereas street families are raised to deal with problems aggressively, violently, and are ultimately streetwise in their approaches, and signs of disrespect in the community are known to all. Violence is a reaction of all of these families. They go on to talk about some less deviant reactions by looking at studies from Hunt, who examined the jam band subculture. Now, the jam band is a subculture that follows in the path of the Grateful Dead. This was seen as a counterculture that has been carried on by bands such as Fish and Dave Matthews, String Cheese Incident, Widespread Panic. These groups promote countercultural philosophies of kind behavior, which is sharing resources, an idea of communal living, and an aversion to status and authority. These are all counterculture perspectives than what you would find normally in mainstream society. And they found that those who attend more jam band events are more emotionally connected to the events themselves. Those members that join the subculture at a younger age have a stronger positive belief in the philosophy. So the longer you've been involved in the culture, the more likely you are to support it. And finally, when we think about deviance in the street and in the suites, we can look at teen and alcohol and drug use. Whaley Smith and Hayes Smith studied 202 school districts at the street level. They found socioeconomic status of the area predicted the use of alcohol and methamphetamine use, but not marijuana and ecstasy. And Lanza, Caduce, Capisci, and Allen are examining the use of alcohol prior to sexual activity among males and female college students. The effect of gender was mediated by the risk and rewards measure in the study, and the limited number of social learning variables did not mediate the Greek effect, where you're finding males trying to over-intoxicate females with the intent of intoxicating to them to such a degree that they would not be able to refuse sex because they would be so intoxicated. So there you have differential association and social learning theories. We'll keep moving on, but as I said, this is one of my favorite theories, and I believe one of the more salient theories in the discipline as of today.